Ethan hadn't seen his sister, Grace, in months. Life had a way of scattering people like leaves in the wind, and he'd been swept up by work, obligations, and a quiet inertia he couldn't quite explain. The drive to her house was familiar yet distant, the kind of route you know by memory but feel strangely removed from each time you travel it. He thought about the last time he had seen her. Grace had been laughing at some minor domestic mishap, Michael standing nearby with his usual calm detachment, observing the world as though it were a chessboard and he were always 10 moves ahead. When Ethan pulled into the driveway, the garden looked exactly as he remembered, a careful arrangement of flowers, an old oak tree casting a long shadow over the lawn. Grace appeared at the doorway, her smile wide and warm, the sort of smile that could erase months of absence in a single moment. "Ethan! You're finally here," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. He hugged her tightly, sensing the life that pulsed behind her eyes, the vitality of someone grounded in routine yet still full of curiosity about the world. Michael emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of drinks. He was the image of composure, dark hair neatly combed, suit sleeves rolled up, posture perfect. "Ethan," he said, voice measured and polite. There was no warmth in the greeting, but there was also no coldness. He was simply Michael, steady and unshakable, as he always had been. Ethan nodded, offering a half-smile in return, feeling the subtle distance that had always existed between them. The doorbell rang again, sharp and unexpected. Grace's eyes lit up. "That must be Michael's brother," she said casually. "Lucas is here." Ethan had heard about Lucas in passing, through the occasional family story or social media snapshot. Michael's younger brother was different from his elder sibling, more fluid in demeanor, more spontaneous in gesture, the sort of person who seemed to occupy space effortlessly. When Lucas stepped inside, Ethan was struck immediately. He had a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. His dark eyes scanned the room with ease, a playful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ethan," Lucas said, extending his hand in a firm, deliberate gesture. His voice carried warmth and something else, something unspoken that Ethan couldn't immediately define. They shook hands, a brief spark of connection passing between them, subtle but undeniable. Grace clapped her hands together. "Why don't you two catch up over some drinks? I'll get dinner ready." She bustled off to the kitchen, leaving the two men in the living room. The air between them felt charged, though neither spoke immediately. Lucas tilted his head, studying Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "I hear a lot about you," he said casually, but there was a weight behind the words. "Mostly good things, I promise." Ethan laughed lightly, brushing off the slight unease that had settled in his stomach. "And I've heard about you too," Ethan replied, the words tasting stranger than expected. There was a cadence to Lucas's presence that unsettled him. Not in a threatening way, but in the way a mirror unsettles when it shows more than you're ready to see. After a pause, Lucas leaned back slightly and said, "You should come by my place sometime. I'll show you my house." There was a casual ease in the invitation, almost offhand, yet Ethan sensed something deliberate beneath the surface. The suggestion was innocent enough on its face, but the subtle undertone hinted at a curiosity and openness Ethan had not anticipated. Grace returned at that moment with a tray of snacks, breaking the tension. "Don't get him into trouble," she said lightly, laughing. "Ethan, you'll find Lucas is, well, he's a handful sometimes." Lucas laughed too, the sound rich and easy, and Ethan found himself smiling despite the strange flutter in his chest. They spent the evening talking, about trivial things at first, work, mutual friends, the odd anecdote from family gatherings. Lucas had a way of listening that made Ethan feel like the room had shrunk around them, like everyone else existed at the edge of perception. Each glance, each laugh, each subtle shift in posture seemed magnified, laden with a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. He noticed the way Lucas's hand occasionally brushed against the armrest near him, the way his eyes held just a little longer than necessary when Ethan spoke. By the time dessert was served, Ethan was restless in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't desire, exactly, at least, not in the way he feared, but a deep, insistent curiosity. He was drawn to Lucas in a way that felt both exhilarating and frightening. The room felt charged with unspoken questions, unspoken truths, and Ethan was acutely aware of the moral tightrope he was balancing on. Later, as he prepared to leave, Lucas came to the door with him. "So, tomorrow," he said, not pressing, just suggesting. Ethan hesitated, feeling the weight of family ties, loyalty, and propriety. And yet, the curiosity, the sense of connection that had threaded itself through the evening, was impossible to ignore. Ethan nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," he said. The word felt heavier than expected, a quiet promise suspended in the cool night air. Lucas smiled, a subtle curve of lips that carried more meaning than words ever could, and the moment passed. Ethan drove home that night with his mind in a whirl. He thought about Grace, about Michael, about the fragile web of family and obligation. And he thought about Lucas, about the intensity in his gaze, the effortless charm, the quiet invitation. Ethan knew he was stepping into unknown territory, yet he also understood something important. Sometimes, the most profound truths begin with the simplest of invitations, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt awake. The next afternoon, Ethan found himself driving to Lucas's house, the street strangely quiet as if the world had paused for him to confront whatever awaited. The memory of last night's dinner clung to him, the warmth of Grace's laughter, the measured calm of Michael, and above all, the intensity behind Lucas's gaze. Ethan had been hesitant all morning, questioning the decision to come, but curiosity had a weight that reason could not counter. Lucas's home was tucked away at the edge of town, a modern structure with clean lines and large windows that reflected the muted autumn sky. When Ethan pulled up, Lucas was already outside, leaning casually against his car, as if he had been waiting, not impatiently, but with a quiet certainty. "Hey," Lucas said, voice carrying that same effortless warmth that made the simplest greeting feel significant. "Glad you came." His smile was genuine, yet there was a hint of something unreadable in his expression, a complexity that both intrigued and unsettled Ethan. "Thanks for inviting me," Ethan replied, stepping out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Something about the environment heightened his awareness. The house, the garden, even the silence seemed charged with anticipation. Lucas gestured toward the front door. "Come on, I'll show you around." There was no rush in his movements, yet every gesture seemed purposeful, deliberate. Ethan followed, trying to mask the flutter of nerves that had settled in his chest. Inside, the house was expansive yet welcoming. The living area was bright, with natural light spilling across polished floors and minimalist decor. Artwork adorned the walls, each piece carefully chosen, each telling a story that Ethan felt he was not entirely permitted to read yet. Lucas began explaining the origins of the paintings, the travels that had inspired them, and the quiet pride in his voice made Ethan notice details he might have otherwise ignored, the subtle warmth of a home carefully curated, the personal touches that revealed character. As they moved from room to room, the conversation shifted from casual observation to something deeper. Lucas talked about the choices that had brought him here, the compromises, the quiet sacrifices he had made to maintain appearances for the family, the ways in which he had had to hide pieces of himself. Ethan listened, initially out of politeness, then with an intensity that surprised him. Each word seemed to resonate with something inside him, awakening thoughts and feelings he had long ignored. "You know," Lucas said as they reached the balcony overlooking the backyard, "sometimes people see the surface and assume they know the story, but they rarely understand the layers underneath." His tone was soft, reflective, almost vulnerable. Ethan glanced at him, noticing the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers lingered on the railing as if seeking steadiness. I think I understand," Ethan said carefully. "It's difficult to live according to expectations that aren't your own." The words felt both personal and distant, as if he were speaking about someone else while knowing they applied to him just as much. Lucas nodded, a quiet acknowledgement. "Exactly. And yet, even when we step into new spaces, meet new people, there's a risk, isn't there? A risk that everything we hide will somehow surface in the wrong moment." He paused, letting the thought hang in the air between them. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was charged, an unspoken recognition of shared understanding. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, not from fear but from the intensity of the connection forming in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. They spoke of loneliness, of the yearning for acceptance, of the ways in which family and societal expectations could confine a person's true self. Lucas's honesty was disarming, his voice steady yet carrying a weight that drew Ethan in. A sudden drizzle began outside, the soft patter of rain against the glass creating an intimate cocoon within the home. Ethan noticed how the atmosphere had shifted, the light dimmed, the space felt smaller, more private. Lucas moved closer, not overtly, but enough to reduce the space between them, a gesture that seemed natural in context yet carried layers of meaning. Ethan caught himself noticing the curve of Lucas's smile, the subtle inflection in his voice, and the thoughtful way he listened. "I think it's rare to find someone who truly sees you," Lucas said quietly, almost to himself. "Someone who doesn't judge, doesn't expect, doesn't try to fit you into a mold." His gaze met Ethan's for a brief moment, steady and probing, and for a second, the rest of the world fell away. Ethan realized that this was not about temptation in the conventional sense, it was about recognition, a meeting of understanding that was rare and fragile. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, aware of the moral boundaries he was navigating. He reminded himself of Grace, of Michael, of the invisible lines that should not be crossed. And yet, he could not ignore the pull, the subtle exhilaration of being in a space where he felt genuinely acknowledged. The emotional tension was a quiet storm, more powerful than any physical act could ever be. Lucas broke the silence with a soft laugh, easing the weight of the moment. "I know this is strange," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just enjoy the company. Sometimes, that's enough." Ethan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly. He realized he was not here because of a reckless impulse, but because he was searching, for understanding, for connection, for a mirror to reflect aspects of himself he had long denied. As the rain continued outside, Lucas walked Ethan to the door. "Thanks for coming," he said. "It means more than you might realize." His expression was earnest, devoid of pretense. Ethan nodded, feeling the resonance of the moment, the depth of the subtle bond that had formed. Driving home later, Ethan replayed the visit in his mind, the words, the glances, the quiet honesty that had been exchanged. He understood that nothing explicit had occurred, and yet he was changed. The encounter had opened doors within himself, doors he had kept shut for years, doors that demanded reflection, courage, and perhaps even acceptance. By the time he arrived at his own home, night had fallen, and the streets were slick with rain. Ethan's thoughts were tangled, heavy yet luminous with possibility. He knew that the visit had been more than a casual tour of a house, it had been a confrontation with truth, a mirror of what he felt but could not yet articulate. And he knew, with an undeniable clarity, that the story was far from over. The evening ended not with resolution, but with the quiet understanding that some connections, though restrained, could shift the course of one's life in ways both subtle and profound. Ethan fell asleep that night with a mind alive with questions and a heart stirred by the possibility of discovery. Ethan woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest that he hadn't expected. The memory of his visit to Lucas's house lingered like a subtle fragrance, pleasant, unsettling, impossible to ignore. As he moved through the quiet of his apartment, the sunlight slanting through the blinds caught dust motes in a way that made the room feel simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. His thoughts circled Lucas, the intensity in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the effortless way he seemed to understand truths that Ethan had spent years hiding from himself. Grace called later, her voice cheerful over the phone. "Breakfast at my place?" she asked. Ethan agreed, though he felt an odd dissonance between the familiarity of her invitation and the turbulence inside him. At breakfast, Grace noticed his distraction. "You've been quiet," she said, setting down her coffee. "Something on your mind?" Ethan forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just tired, I guess," he said. But he knew the explanation was thin. Thoughts of Lucas, the subtle tension, the connection, the moral complexity, occupied more space than he cared to admit. The day passed slowly. Messages from Lucas arrived intermittently, short and casual. "Hope your day is going well," one read. Ethan hesitated before replying, conscious of the delicate balance he was navigating between curiosity and propriety. He responded briefly, avoiding the temptation to dwell on the subtext of their interaction. Each notification felt like a pulse, reminding him that the story was not yet complete. Later in the week, Lucas unexpectedly appeared at Grace's house. Ethan's heart skipped, caught off guard by the presence that had already taken on more significance than he expected. Lucas greeted him with a nod, an acknowledgement that carried layers of meaning without words. Grace, unaware of the unspoken dynamics, chatted animatedly about her week, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Michael, who listened silently as always. Ethan noticed the subtle exchanges, glances, pauses in conversation, a hand lightly brushing the edge of a chair, that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. He realized that this was not about physical attraction, at least not in the conventional sense. It was about recognition, being seen in a way that required neither explanation nor justification. He felt a mixture of exhilaration and guilt, a complex cocktail of emotions that left him simultaneously energized and burdened. During lunch, Lucas leaned in slightly while discussing mundane topics, and Ethan caught himself absorbing every word, every inflection. The conversation drifted toward personal histories, family expectations, and the choices that define us. Lucas spoke candidly about his own struggles, the ways he had to conceal aspects of himself, and the quiet courage it required to live authentically. Ethan listened, recognizing reflections of his own internal conflicts. "You know," Lucas said softly, "sometimes the hardest part isn't discovering who you are, it's accepting it. Accepting it without fear, without shame." His words lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, striking chords within Ethan that he hadn't realized were still tender. Ethan felt compelled to respond, to articulate the truth he had kept locked away. Yet he paused, weighing the consequences, the familial ties, the delicate morality of the situation. In that pause, he realized something crucial: this wasn't about temptation or betrayal. It was about reflection, acknowledgement, and understanding. After the lunch concluded, Lucas stayed behind for a moment to speak privately. "Ethan," he said, his tone gentle, "you don't have to respond in any particular way. Just know that honesty, with yourself first, matters more than any expectation." The words were simple, but their weight was immense. Ethan nodded, feeling the quiet gravity of the moment, recognizing that this exchange was a turning point, a subtle but profound shift in his consciousness. As Lucas left, the air in the house seemed to settle differently. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and tension, a sense that something important had occurred without dramatic action or overt confession. He understood that this was not the conclusion of the story but the beginning of an inner journey, one that would require reflection, courage, and perhaps even confrontation with truths he had long ignored. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his room, replaying the events of the week. He thought about Grace, about Michael, about the unspoken rules of family and society. He also thought about Lucas, about the rare clarity and acknowledgement he had received, the mirror held up to his own suppressed identity. The realization was profound: connections do not always need to manifest in grand gestures. Sometimes, a quiet understanding, a shared glance, or a single sentence can redefine perspectives, priorities, and desires. Ethan wrote in his journal, carefully choosing words that allowed him to explore emotions without judgment. He reflected on guilt, curiosity, and authenticity, recognizing the necessity of separating impulse from insight. The visit to Lucas's home, the conversations, the subtle tension, all had been catalysts for something greater, a confrontation with the self, with truths that had long been buried beneath routine, expectation, and fear. In the days that followed, Ethan and Lucas maintained a cautious distance, their interactions brief but meaningful. Each message, each meeting, each conversation carried layers of significance, building a quiet narrative of understanding rather than action. Ethan discovered that the value of these moments lay not in what was done, but in what was recognized, acknowledged, and held in confidence. By the end of the week, Ethan realized he had changed in subtle yet undeniable ways. He was more attuned to his emotions, more aware of the boundaries between desire and morality, connection and complication. He had learned that human relationships are rarely simple, that honesty with oneself is a form of courage, and that understanding does not always require action. It can exist quietly, shaping decisions, thoughts, and future paths. As he prepared for another weekend visit to Grace's house, Ethan felt a sense of calm tempered by anticipation. He knew that the story with Lucas was not a tale of dramatic conflict or overt scandal. Instead, it was a story of recognition, self-reflection, and the delicate dance of morality and human connection. It ended not with resolution, but with clarity, a bittersweet acceptance of complexity. Ethan understood one final truth: life rarely offers answers in neat packages. Some of the most profound experiences are those that leave questions lingering, allowing reflection, growth, and understanding to flourish quietly in their wake. And in that quiet space, he felt both awakened and prepared, for whatever challenges, connections, or revelations might lie ahead.